Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. It is October 22nd, 2024. The time now is 6:01 p.m. Eastern Time. Today, we're going to talk about a research paper that was done by Stanford Research Institute back in the 70s. I believe it was 70s. And it goes along with the changing images of man. What about the changing images of man? This is what they were saying, or Fred Pollack stated in 1973. Any student of the rise and fall of cultures cannot fail to be impressed by the role in this historical succession by the image of the future. The rise and fall of images of the future precedes and accompanies the rise and fall of cultures. In the end, the future may well be decided by the image which carries the greatest spiritual power. Again, that was Fred Pollack, 1973. So, from the beginning of human existence, man has relied on mythological images and symbolic metaphors to help bring meaning and purpose to his life. Today, we use these images to define the many evolutionary stages of human history, each image serving as a snapshot, helping to condense the complexity of each era into a single, easy to understand, archetypal symbol. When we think of a man in prehistoric times, we imagine him as a spear-wielding master of nature, just as early as caveman drawings or paintings had depicted. During the ancient Egyptian era, he had evolved into becoming a master of his fellow man, and is most commonly represented by the iconic golden image of King Tutankhamun. As scientific method emerged during the Renaissance of early European modern history, man stepped out from underneath the mystical authority of God to become the master of the universe. And this is what Leonardo da Vinci's hypothesized: the perfectly proportioned Vitruvian man. Even more recently, our multinational, well, we are multidimensional. Our multinational industrialized epic can be summed up by the image of a tailored suit wearing modern man, which was on the move, who has traded his spear for a briefcase. These mythological images or symbolic metaphors fulfill an important purpose in helping man not only understand who he is, but also who he was, and most importantly, who he will become in the future. Without these strong self-images, man loses his sense of identity and risks losing his very meaning and purpose. Over the last several decades, it certainly seems as though man has lost his identity. Our Western world has undergone such a drastic technological transformation that it has proven increasingly more difficult to accurately define our purpose and meaning. This, categorized by today's massive instability and unprecedented social or societal chaos that threatens to overturn our Western values. It certainly should come as no surprise that as the division of labor reduced once fulfilling jobs to the most mechanized and menial of tasks, and urbanization led to an unhealthy dependency upon institutions, and the standardization of the Western school system robbed man of his individuality that we are now seeing a crisis of identity unfolding. And this is done in the most non-descriptive descriptive of eras. In addition, following the 1960s, a large section of the population became disillusioned. People began disengaging from society in search of an identity, but failed to find one in a culture driven by faceless commodity and consumption. At the time of Stanford Research Institute study, society society had existed without a true sense of purpose or meaning, and this was for a considerable time. And according to the experts, this lack of strong self-image was having an immense negative impact on society as a whole. We were in desperate need of an image makeover. But what would the next image of man look like? This was a question that a small group of scientists working out of the Research Institute in Santa Clara Valley, California, soon to be known as Silicon Valley, were determined to answer. Now, this is an article that was written by someone that has not written the Encyclopedia of Mind Control. So, this is the perspective of someone that was looking at it from the surface level. But as we've been reading for the last week, it was all by design. They wanted to change the behavior of man, the identity of man. They wanted to be able to control the masses. So, from someone looking from the outside in, it looks like it's something that just happened spontaneously. But again, as we read over in the book in the last few weeks, in the last few days, actually, it was all pre-planned going back decades. So this is what they stated. This was a study that was done in the 1970s, where the changing images of man was a culmination of an 8-month study that was administered by the Urban and Societal or Social Systems Division at Stanford Research Institute. Various quote unquote intellectuals from fields of social sciences, humanities, engineering, and physics collaborated in an attempt to one, illuminate ways our present society, its citizens, and institutions have been shaped by the underlying myths and the images of the past and present. So, again, remember, these are people that were actually working in mind control and behavior modification. Per the surface level, this is what they were trying to do: explore the deficiencies of current held images of humankind to identify needed characteristics of the future images. Two, identify high leverage activities that could facilitate the emergence of a new image and a new policy approach to the resolution of key problems in society. Essentially, the basis of their study was to identify and consider the viability and efficacy of all possible ways or high level activities in which they could socially engineer the American public towards a new self image through the use of propaganda. The key research staff at SRI was led by Project Director O.W. Markley and was assisted by an advisory panel with several well known public figures, including world famous behaviorist B.F. Skinner from the Harvard Department of Psychology and Henry Margenau from the Department of Physics at Yale. Their well known cultural anthropologist, Margaret Mead from the American Museum of Natural History, and popular mythologist and author of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell. And this is what they stated: society grows ever more complex, specialized in interconnectedness. and the production and distribution of essential goods and services is increasingly dependent on the continued integrity of human institutional systems. Human systems, however, depend on trust, agreement, and political law rather than on unchanging quote unquote natural law. Hence, they are inherently less stable in times of rapid cultural change than our quote unquote natural systems. They are particularly sensitive to the breakdowns caused by war, caused by terrorism, and simplistic attempts at societal reform. Within the 300-page report, the researchers at SRI identified 7 different functions of society in which the power of the images could be used to acquiesce the population into a state of subservience. These functions were mainly derived from Joseph Campbell's previous work on mythology and his knowledge of past civilizations. They included mystical, cosmological, sociological, pedagogical, psychological, editorial, political, and magical. Contained with these 7 functions are the many institutions, government agencies, organizations, and groups that serve as authorities in our society. While the researchers found that the mystical and magical functions to be largely ineffective due to the public's inability to consider the former anything more than superstitious, and that the latter to be negatively associated with the diminishing power of the church, they did find that other functions were worthy of further development. The cosmology function is, quote, to form and present images of the universe and the world according with the local knowledge and experience. This function is performed by the scientific community, and today we see a grossly exaggerated reliance on the word of scientific quote unquote experts. The sociological function enjoys perhaps the widest interpretation and includes the social sciences, the various social programs, special interest groups, nonprofit organizations, non governmental organizations, as well as a mass communication, Hollywood, and the entertainment industry. Today, this function must assuredly include social media giants like Google, YouTube, Facebook, Yahoo, and Twitter, now known as X. The pedagogical educational function has proven most effective in shaping society through the public school system, as well as the higher learning institutions of academia. Both have become the perfect breeding ground for the enforcement of social order and the manufacturing of public opinion. Today, we see the university campus being used as an ideological battleground, especially at Berkeley University, which is located just north of Stanford and Oakland. The editorial function of the society is performed by the quote unquote funding agencies, which are really the government legislators and departments of program planning, foundations, and so forth, who are also who also represent special interest groups in the selection of which aspects of reality should be collectively ignored and which attended to. Today, foundations like the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and the Open Society Foundation all play major roles in the shaping of society, not only domestically, but on an international scale. And then he states, This is an article by Dwayne Hayes, and he states, read my prior articles where he talks about why philanthropy organizations are the problem. So his previous article was philanthropic foundations and why they are a problem, and how foundations created academia. And then he goes into detail about why they're the issue. So the political function is distinct from the strictly sociological function, which appears wherever a myth or institution of society is deliberately employed to represent the claim to the privilege and authority of some special person or a race or a social class or a nation or a civilization. Today, our society has been inundated with these types of social justice authorities, and they're demanding quote unquote equality of race, class, equality of gender, and ethnicity. According to the changing images of man, the authoritative powers within the above mentioned seven functions were then applied to all four quote unquote sources of societal problems. And this was done in order to affect the very beliefs, the very values, and the very perceptions of society. These four levels are made up of one, the state of the society, two, behavior, three, the motivations, and four, the basic values. As figure 7 demonstrates below, we see how the state of society can be directly affected by the individual actions and behaviors of its citizens. The scientists and researchers at the SRI had rightly concluded that it is upon the foundation of our basic values and perceptions that our motivations are built, and our motivations will manifest themselves into reality through our behavior, while our collective behavior as a society ultimately determines the general state of our society as a whole. Which raises the obvious question most pertinent to the specific discussion. Where do our values and perceptions come from? Our beliefs, our values, and our perception or perceptions originates from our culture. In fact, they are the direct result of the above mentioned seven functions of society. We are born into an already well established set of cosmological, sociological, pedagogical, psychological, editorial, political, magical, and mythical beliefs that we are forced to adopt for fear we may fail to conform within a larger society belief system. The SRI referred to this process of indoctrination as the quote, directed emotional conditioning. And this is a directed emotional conditioning of children. As we grow older and gain more information, our values and beliefs and perceptions are further implanted within us, in much as the same way a plant photosynthesizes the energy of the sun. What the SRI called, quote unquote, the objectively constructed reinforcement patterns. We become a product of our own environment. Those who step out of this construct are quickly stigmatized as a social outlier, contemptible contrarians who are then ridiculed into submission by the majority. The very existence of this social construct depends heavily on the effectiveness of both our initial conditioning and the subsequent reinforcement of the patterns. Of course, this was well understood by the assembled scientists at SRI. Interestingly, the shaping of thought in order to steer society in a predetermined direction is the very definition of brainwashing. The only thing left for SRI is to decide Which of the many techniques proposed would be implemented? What behavior modification strategies would prove most effective in the establishment of a more docile, benevolent society? These questions were formed in the heart of the study. This is what was stated. Only if such mentalistic and pre scientific concepts as will, freedom, and consciousness, and so forth are cast off, Skinner asserts, does man have a chance to attain a truly peaceful, rational, and humane society in the future. Again, B.F. Skinner. The research staff at SRI left no stone unturned in their search for ways to inculate or inculcate the masses, even considering the viability of telekinesis, biofeedback loops, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, hypnosis, subliminal messaging, hallucinogenics, and psychotropic drugs. Each strategy was identified and discussed at length over the 8-month study, then was summarized within Chapter 4, Influence of Science on the Image of Man. The study called upon behavioral scientist B.F. Skinner to offer his expertise on the examination of man as a mechanism and to elaborate on his operant conditioning techniques. Also discussed was the viability of quote unquote genetic modification. Also discussed was quote unquote brain surgery to prevent aggressive behavior. And number 7, quote, electrical brain implants was another discussion. Another discussion, number 8, was quote, sophisticated electronic surveillance mechanisms to detect aberrant behavior patterns. 9, they stated, incredibly, they also proposed the development of chemical based psychotechnologies, which were primarily to bring control over the tendencies of the national leaders in an attempt to lower the possibility of nuclear war. The SRI also urged the development of psycho-civilized society, such that dangerous behaviors in man can be modified by electrical stimulation of the brain. While they also considered the quote unquote profound moral questions that arise from such activities, they also stated which, if unresolved, might propel civilization towards the brave new world in 1984. But again, they were already planning this. They were orchestrating this. That was the whole purpose. The branch of the school of thought, which has proved most successful, emphasizes that the technique of operant conditioning, which is a term originated by B.F. Skinner, denotes a systematic procedure whereby the actions of an organism are brought under control by giving it a reward if and only if it behaves in a specified manner. This technique has been successfully used in education systems, psychotherapy, and in the prison system, and this is to alter whole behavior patterns of individuals. Certainly, the techniques that have been employed within the view of the man as a mechanism are powerful and efficient. They work. Hence, if integrated and reconciled with other views of man, views which have more adequate ethics and metaphysics, both terms that behaviorists and scientists insist are not part of his concern, on which to guide their application, this view and its products could conceivably be of great benefit to mankind. So, the psychotropic drug scenario proposed by SRI was eerily reminiscent of Aldous Huxley's Soma and was found to be one of the more easy to apply. Nearly 40 years later, we are witnessing the horrific results. Coincidentally or not, the dramatic upward statistical trend of prescription drug use in America began in the years immediately following the SRI's report, and it is only matched by the rising death toll attributed to it. A seemingly never ending list of antidepressants, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers, and hypnotic sedatives like Adderall and Ambien and Ativan and Dextrogen and Lithium and Paxil and Prozac and Ritalin and Valium and Xanax and Zoloft have continued to flood the market ever since, or flood the markets ever since. As those who lived through the 1980s would know, the number of prescription drugs on the market was relatively minimal to what we see now. According to the recent statistics compiled by the CDC, nearly half of the US population was on at least one prescription drug during the last year between 2011 and 2014. One quarter of the population was on two prescription drugs, and 10% of the population were on five or more prescription drugs. According to more recent research published by the Journal of American Medical Association, the number of Americans on prescribed drugs in 2015 was 59%, while those on five or more jumped to 15%. In another report, the American Psychological Association found a threefold increase in the use of antidepressants from the 1988 to 2002. While research compiled by David Muzina, MD, which is a psychiatrist at the Medco Neuroscience Therapeutic Resource Center, he found that the number of children receiving atypical antipsychotics doubled from year 2000 to the year 2010. In the year 2018, we have the immense advantage of hindsight, with which we can evaluate the situation more closely and even the cursory analysis of the statistics. This reveals a rather unsettling trend. To even the most ardent advocate of psychotropics, there remains a disturbing condition worthy of future consideration. Firstly, it is undeniable that the prescription drugs has exploded, and their use has exploded. And this is in the years immediately following Stanford's report, resulting in some unintended consequences. And these consequences are further being substantiated by an ever-growing mountain of corroborating statistical evidence. And now, with the addition of changing images of man as the primary source material, which is indicating both intent and motive, it becomes entirely possible that this has been a premeditated, coordinated scheme to drug an entire nation, and for that matter, the world, if you think about it, and drug an entire nation into submission. Even the internal or eternal optimist must admit that the numbers are indicative of a deeply corrupted, degenerate system that risks growing completely out of control. And to those that remain skeptical of the conclusions being drawn herein, I invite you to research the sources cited as they are offered for your perusal below. I challenge those doubters to research the ever-widening medical qualifications for depression and attention deficit disorder, and the absurdity of a future in which the entire population of North America Over 350 million people are diagnosed by alleged experts as being depressed, psychotic, or both. A rather different approach to understanding and controlling behavior, also of proven effectiveness, is through the implementation of remotely activated electrodes in the brain. The psycho-civilization of society has been advocated by means of various techniques of behavior modification, such as the operant conditioning by Skinner in 1971 and the electrocranial stimulation by Dr. Delgado in 1969 and the psychochemical drugs by Dr. Clark in 1971. Only if such mentalistic and pre-scientific concepts as your free will or will, freedom, your consciousness, and so forth are cast off, Skinner asserts, does man have a chance to attain a truly peaceful, rational, and humane future. This conveniently leads me to believe, this conveniently leads me to think that the next strategy proposed by the SRI, in which they deliberated the advantage and disadvantages of the public opinion dependent on the word of quote unquote experts. This phenomenon, they say, resulting from the general public's inability to keep up with an increasingly more complex society, that without adequate time to research for themselves, the masses would become overly dependent on the opinions of the experts. And as anyone who has studied the trivium will be aware, this reliance on expert opinion amounts to nothing more than a logical fallacy. The argumentum ad auctoritatem. Yet when we turn on the television or open a newspaper, we are continuously asked ad nauseum to accept simple two-word phrases like experts say as a irrefutable truth, and today this has resulted in an enormous consequence to the society. Now, he says in this article that the SRA predicted this. No, the SRA knew as a warfare strategy, they knew and they understood the psychology of humans that this would destabilize and dumb down the population. They knew this. So SRA even predicted as evidenced by the following expert. The SRA stated in their research, the viability of a democracy depends upon the informed decision-making capacity of its citizenry, i.e., the relative political maturity of the people. The people must at least maintain parity with the complexity of the issues confronting the public. If the acquisition of the relevant knowledge does not proceed at about the same pace at which the decisions become complex, then a relative political maturity will decline. This may have two consequences. One, increasing reliance placed upon the expert, quote unquote, to maintain order and control, with a resulting compromise of our democratic processes, or two, the reluctance to give control to the expert, but with an increasing inability to make informed decisions. The result is that the system may truly go out of control. Well, again, like I said, the philanthropists and the foundations, their whole thing was control the population, create a brave new world or 1984, while at the same time depopulating, sterilizing individuals. So he doesn't yet get into this. So what they're saying here is, in consideration of the reader's time, an effort has been made to keep this blog within reasonable limitations, which dissuades the author from enumerating on all of the possible scenarios discussed within. However, I do wish to cover one final point, one in which the researchers at SRI considered a scenario involving what they referred to as a quote unquote friendly fascism. a scenario described by its creators, Gross and Bertrand, that would, quote, severely reduce individual freedoms under the slogans of democracy and 100% Americanism. And this would be in the form of an advanced technological society that is supported by its techniques, which is a techno urban fascism American style. And when one compares the points proposed below for a fascist society with the world today, we see a striking similarity unable to be explained away by mere coincidence. For anyone above the age of 40 who have asked themselves how the image of our world can change so drastically within the last couple of decades, the following selection may provide some clarity. 1. The application of military surveillance technologies to urban police problems. 2. The utilization of behavior changing drugs and operant conditioning in schools. 3. Government attempts at management of news. 4. Quote unquote personality screening and maintenance of files on quote unquote pre delinquent children through cooperation between elementary school administrators, local and state and federal authorities. 5. The cross correlation of computer based files containing personal data. This includes your credit, your employment records, your tax status, your insurance information, your criminal record information, and your education information. 6. The introduction of legislation to control access to techniques for self initiated alteration of consciousness, both non drug and drug induced. He continues, it is interesting that within a decade of publishing the changing images of man, we see the meteoric rise of both Silicon Valley and the World Wide Web, both originating directly from out of this innocuous private research institute, colloquially known as the quote unquote farm. Through the use of primary source material, we see the blueprint from which a plan is devised to socially engineer the American public and, for that, the world public through its various institutions and agencies, followed by the establishment of the very tools to best facilitate the plan. We also see a deep military affiliation with the project, in which the internet stems directly from the Pentagon's ARPANET program, and the Stanford Research Institute is one of the three original hubs for the internet. And this was as early as 1969. Stanford University is centered within a few miles radius of all the social media giants like Google, like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, now known as X, and Yahoo. And all of these survivors of the dot-com era had major ties to the intelligence community, while also conveniently forming the mainframe and framework that is social media. It is just coincidence that these were lucky, or the lucky few that survived the dot-com crash and then go on to dominate the web. Today, we see the Defense Department investing billions of dollars on venture capital into Silicon Valley technology. And it's a harder argument to make that this is all by accident or coincidence. You can argue it is by design, especially when you compare the proposed strategies covered above with what has manifested within the society. There remains no doubt in this author's mind that the Stanford Research Institute, their study of the changing images of man, is a playbook from which originated a plan of full spectrum dominance over the society. As of this writing of the article, it has progressed and it's almost complete. Today, it certainly seems as though society has become directionless, and maybe all of the hitherto and fro of technology has served to mask the deeper issue of societal stagnation. The once archetypal image of the family oriented nuclear father of the 50s has been persuaded to shun the responsibility of manhood and embrace narcissistic perpetual leisure. And as one looks around, there is most definitely considerable evidence to suggest this is something that is true. As a society, we seem to lack a clear picture of where we are going and what we are supposed to do. And as we wait for the next image to appear, we will continue to endure the chaos. What will the next image of man look like? Will he adapt to the imminently approaching era of digital distribution of networks? Maybe he has fallen victim to the transhumanist movement and will emerge from behind the curtain only half of a man and half machine. Perhaps he continues down his present path and becomes a simulacrum of a man, a soulless caricature of his former self in the image of Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin. At this point, no one knows for sure. But what is alarming is that the social science experts, television talking heads, and the authorities of the state are forcibly remove the word man from our vocabulary and the word son from even our national anthems. Any way you choose to look at it, man as we have known him is quickly disappearing. And it is the opinion of the author that we must initiate this image ourselves, because if we allow a totalitarian government to provide it, we most certainly will not like the image that we are given. And the perfect antidote to tyrannical authority remains well developed, intelligent individuals. So again, this was actually this blog article was written 7 years ago. Right on point. Right on point. He didn't get into the details again, like I said, how I've been getting into it in the last few days. I wanted to do this side article and then continue the book. So you can see how people were already thinking about this a decade ago, like, 7 years ago. People were already talking about this. And again, everything that's being rolled out is military warfare, psychological warfare. The behavior modification aspect is military strategy, but it's not against other nations. It's against the population. It's always been about they and us, them versus us. And them or they, quote unquote, they are again the bloodlines, the families, the the others that don't see us as human beings, basically. So I'll be back later on to continue the book on mind control.